Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 198. Really excited for today's guest because it's someone that I've gotten to know really well over the last couple of months. He's a new member of our CSP Florida staff, moved down from the Pacific Northwest to join our team, and has done his awesome job as a manual therapist. He's got a cool background that makes him a really insightful guy with respect to all things lower extremity. And we're going to talk about foot and ankle function, something I think gets really heavily overlooked in really every population, but particularly in a world like baseball where people spend hours and hours in blocky cleats and may not realize how much they're giving up on overall health and function of their feet that could have some really far-reaching impacts on performance. So we're in for a really good one with an awesome guest. Overuse injuries have emerged as one of the biggest threats to players at every level of competition. As an example, at the professional level, ulnar collateral ligament injuries at the elbow alone sideline pitchers for an average of over 17 months. That's a ton of lost development and a threat to lengthy careers. Just as concerningly, though, for youth players, overuse is the predominant mechanism of injury. So what can be done? Obviously, we need to train athletes to be prepared for all the stresses the game throws at them. However, the other side of the equation, recovery, often doesn't get the attention it deserves. Healthy, recovered arms mean you can stay in the game and give your best on the field, and that's where Mark Pro comes in. Mark Pro is a cutting-edge recovery tool that provides all the benefits of active recovery, but without the extra effort, muscular fatigue, or stress to tendons and joints. Players can use Mark Pro as long as needed for exceptional recovery between training sessions or after games. We'll often send Mark Pro units back with athletes to their hotels or even have them use them on team flights. Both easy to use and portable, Mark Pro is a powerful tool that allows recovery anywhere, anytime. Use it while relaxing at home, on the road, or during tournaments. On a personal note, I was originally a naysayer when it came to Mark Pro. However, longtime Cressey sports performance athlete Corey Kluber turned me onto it. He adopted Mark Pro into his post-pitching recovery approach, and it was an integral part of him going out and throwing 200 innings year after year. This led me to experiment with it myself and with more of our athletes, and the feedback was consistently outstanding. Now, just a few years later, you'll see it in every major league organization as part of the routines of some of the most accomplished baseball players on the planet. If you're looking for the same results enjoyed by these athletes, visit markpro.com and use the coupon code Cressey at checkout for an exclusive discount. Again, that's markpro.com, markpro.com, and use the coupon code Cressey, Cressey, at checkout for an exclusive discount. Today's guest serves as a chiropractor and manual therapist at Cressey Sports Performance Florida in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. He's native to the Pacific Northwest, where he first started his journey into sports medicine during his undergraduate education at Western Oregon University. There, he played baseball for 2 years and ran track and field for 3 years, and became a top 10 800-meter runner in the country. He earned his Doctor of Chiropractic and Master's of Sports Science at the University of Western States in Portland, Oregon. He's been working in Seattle in the sports medicine field with a manual therapy and rehabilitation focus since 2019. In addition to his chiropractic training, he's well-versed in a variety of manual therapy approaches, including fascial manipulation, active release techniques, and dynamic neuromuscular stabilization manual therapy. While prepared to treat a wide variety of skeletal muscle conditions, given his track and field background, he's particularly intrigued by lower extremity challenges, and that's what makes him a great fit for the podcast topic at hand. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Ryan Hansen. Dr. Ryan Hansen, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
No worries. Psyched to do this. We've been having some awesome conversations since you joined the team down at CSP Florida, so I'm very excited to share this with a larger audience. So I'll backtrack. When we were going through, kind of the interview process, getting you come down to CSP Florida and everything, there was a question I asked you, and I think it was to the effect of, what is your wheelhouse? Like if somebody walks in off the street and you are the best person on the planet to help fix them, you told me two things. You said acute low back pain and all things foot and ankle. And it led to this long, elaborate discussion. We talked about your history and all that stuff. So, you're a self-proclaimed foot nerd, but maybe the best place to start is what brought you to a point of being so interested in the structure and the function of the feet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if for a lot of people and a lot of these things, it comes with your own personal story. And I had battled Achilles tendonitis after I left baseball and got into track and field and just started running so aggressively without a lot of base on me. And that led to some pretty serious Achilles tendinopathy that I battled for about 10 years. even through med school. So I started med school in 2015, and about 2016, 17 is when I really started to get into this foot stuff. And what really drew me to it was when I was in cadaver lab, medical cadaver lab, and we were starting to dissect the foot and appreciating all of the intricacies of the foot and how complex it is below the lower leg and how much it plays a role with in how we interact with the ground and how it's the first thing that comes into the foundation of the body when we start to absorb forces. And in about 2017, when I started my master's of sports medicine, I really got introduced to Dr. Laura Conley out of Colorado. Gait Happens on Instagram. I recommend a huge follow. She's done amazing things for myself. Gary Ward with A Matters with some of the wedges we have in the gym. To Sports Chiro Luke on Instagram. He's an Australian chiropractor who's done a lot of lower extremity work and calf strengthening and foot problems and how to get yourself out of those. And then Chris Johnson, who's a PT in the Seattle, Washington area, who works with a lot of high level triathletes. And when I had a knee issue actually going on from trying to run and get ready for a triathlon, we found out that a lot of it was coming from my really, really stiff foot from a kind of a mid-distance sprint background, which is basically have a rigid, stiff foot to push through the ground. And I never really learned how to get out of that and kind of create this kind of coil spring-like foot. So I just dove headfirst into it and just appreciated it because I think in a lot of sports, especially, it's kind of an ignored little topic. It's kind of pushed under the radar a little bit. It's not as appreciated, at least when I was going through school. And I think it's come a long way. But about 2017, 2018, with my own history, I really started diving into the foot. And about 2 years ago, I finally got rid of this Achilles tendinopathy, and it's been gone ever since.
I love that. I always joke in the baseball world, like, you're not best off learning a curveball from the big leaguer who like rolled out of bed spinning it at a high level. You're better off learning a curveball, honestly, from the guy who like struggled to get something that was serviceable in double A
Yeah.
and had to try 800 different ways how to do it. So, one of the questions I would ask you as a follow-up to that is what didn't work, right? A decade is a long time to struggle with something. Like, it's kind of, to be honest, some of my own shoulders history and why I kind of fell
Totally.
into this world. Like, what were some of the things that you tried that failed miserably or delivered, just marginal results at best?
Absolutely. I think I took a huge passive role at the start. Hey, roll my feet, roll my calves, constantly stretch. The stretching would give me minor results for a little bit. I start loading it back up, it'd come right back. Stretch some more, stretch some more, and it would feel good. So I just would chase that for a long time, especially we know with the stretch reflex, it will help kind of decrease or modulate some pain, give you a little break, and then you can get right back onto what you're doing. Most of the time it came right back. And then shoving my feet into very, very tight toe box, small
Yeah.
shoes. Like you've seen at the gym, my feet like to splay a little bit. I got a decently wide foot. So going into a constant compression and then having some tight heels that would constantly squeeze on my Achilles would definitely just give me havoc. And I would just try to run right through it. Being an athlete, if I was 80%, I'm 100%. But it would lock me up to the point where I would run or I would feel fine one day and I'd wake up in the morning and couldn't even step through my foot and I'd have to like shuffle and gait it for a little bit. And I just got to the point of like, I've got to switch this up. Like, obviously this isn't working for the last 5, 6, 7 years. And then I think what wasn't working is just, you don't know what you don't know. And I was lost a little bit trying to figure out and was thankful that school brought me around to some good
Yeah.
individuals and just the classes that I took, but a lot of it was passive stuff. And I think I told you in the gym, your passive stuff is only as good as your active stuff is
Yeah.
working, right? Like if your active stuff isn't on point with the load modulation or creating your own program actively, your icing, your heating, your
Yeah.
rolling out, your stretching is only going to get you so
Yeah.
far, if
You're
not put a
playing for the
blanket on
tie at
things.
best, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so I think you and I understand this, but maybe for our casual listeners, you talk about taking an active approach. Like, define what that means, maybe even speak specifically to what it meant for you in terms of like lower leg health.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really appreciating for me is like diving into the foot complex and what it needs from a load standpoint,
Mhm.
whether that be from the intrinsic foot muscles that control the foot and the foot bones and how it interacts with the ground, or whether that be from the calf complex and hamstring complex, especially with the calf being a two joint two joint cross from the foot across to the knee and plays a role in knee flexion and how it can act in gait. And I found real quickly when I started getting into some calf raises and some foot specific exercise, how weak I was. And it really surprised me of like, man, how long had I been dealing with that through track and field and that weakness, which led to some of my back pain and tightness late in races when I could no longer handle those loads. And I was like, man, if I would have found this earlier, would I have been able to like run faster, run harder, run longer? Probably, but whatever, hindsight's 2020.
That was it. And that's why we're coaching / treating,
Exactly,
right?
exactly. Being able to relate to all these guys who've gone through things and being able to help them. But for me, the biggest thing was understanding the loads that are being placed on the body and body weight. Even body weight calf raises can get you a long way, a good starting point. But again, that's just body weight. Like we know the loads walking and running can equal up to 3-4 times weight, 5-7 times body weight in some specific muscles. So if we're not creating an overload effect, whether with some loaded marches, loaded calf raises, split squat with the heel rise, pushing the toes down, we're not gonna get over that hump, especially when we're in a sprint push off sport such as baseball and track.
Yeah, and I think you hinted at it too, is and this is where I think the conversation becomes very universal, right? You're speaking about this in respect to track and field and all this. Like we see all these guys where you treat them, they feel like $1 million when they get off the table, and then they go throw in a game the next day. You know what I mean? They go right back to picking the scab, and you might have had them on a great path, but they totally overlooked the concept of like building, chronic workload, and instead they just go back to like acutely banging their head against the wall. So
absolutely.
I think it's a great message for like, and we're not just talking about foot and ankle, but it's, it's something that's universal. But maybe building on some of the stuff you said before, you talked about how, you're just fascinated by the structure of the foot. And it's funny because I've always said that I think wrist and hand docs and foot and ankle docs are the smartest, folks in the orthopedic world, just because there's such claustrophobic areas. There's so much stuff coming together in a really, really small area. And obviously there's you're richly, proprioceptive and all that stuff. But I don't think the casual observer to training has a true appreciation for the unique nature of the foot. So, maybe can you enlighten them, speak to structure a little bit about, I always hear you rattling these off when you talk to patients, but I think it's something that's very compelling if you share it with a larger audience here.
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, I like to describe it as like a beautiful chaos in that foot. If we look at it from just a structure standpoint, let's take it with 26 bones, with 33 joints, that within 107 ligaments that go through that foot. We take a look at 29 muscles that interact with the foot. 19 of those are intrinsic, meaning they just control the foot. They have nothing to work with any of the cat or the ankle complex, dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. And then 10 of those extrinsically that are required to cause push off, supinate, pronate the foot. And then one of the most fascinating parts of the foot that I find is the talus, which sits, here's your tibia and fibula, and your talus sits right in here. The talus, if I remember right from anatomy, I think is one of or the only bone that has no muscle attachment to it. It has no play on tension. So, and that is where your foot really starts from the separation of your lower leg, is that talus bone. And so your ankle is really at the mercy of the tension and static position that your foot is in, whether that wants to sit here from injury or just from repetitive motions that have caused to have a flatter foot or a pronated foot. And I find that so fascinating. Like, I mean, the shoulder is a very mobile joint as well, but I mean, it's got a bunch of muscles that attack directly to the labrum, directly to the humerus, and controlling that ball and socket. There really is no rotator cuff for the talus. And it is really determined by on the passive and active structures of how your foot is held in space. And that is going to determine how that's being held through space at rest and when it hits the ground. So if it's anywhere off axis or off kilter, you're already lacking everything up the chain to take on a different role to be able to handle those changes in range of motion and degrees of how it hits the ground.
That's fascinating. I remember John Palloff referred to the subtalar joint a long time ago. He called it a torque converter. That has always stuck with me, right? It's triplanar stress that's really converted to tibial IR, or tibial IR going in the opposite direction. And like when he said that to me, I'm like, oh, this is why the foot and the ankle is so important for everything that happens further up the chain.
Exactly. And if we take a look at like that torque converter and creating that muscle, right? We look at the intrinsic foot muscles 40% of them act on the big toe alone. And so you look at, and then there's more, and like this gets into a little bit of the neurosensory as well. So if those intrinsic foot muscles, they're not very big, but their surface area is massive. And what we look at that in anatomy is muscle spindles within those intrinsic foot muscles relative to the muscle size is pretty low. And so they're not generating a lot of force. They're not in acting in this expulsion or forward movement of locomotion. Basically, their job is to handle when the foot hits the ground, handle the changes in the foot, and allow that foot to kind of stretch, create the mechanoreceptor to go to the brain and let the brain know where it's at in space so it can fire and pull and stiffen that foot when needed and flatten it when needed so the rest of the muscles can do the job of propulsing and locomoting. And if we break that down again and back to the big toe, I was reading some studies on the sensory motor component. I think this plays into our pitchers or even our hitters who have a big leg kick. When that flexor digitorum brevis, if my index finger is my big toe, it kind of helps bring that foot out and create that wide toe splay. The abductor hallucis brevis is one of the most responsible muscles for balance. And so if we really have a lengthened hallucis or brevis muscle where we don't have good sensory mapping in that foot, we get a guy with a big leg kick and his foot can't stable. It needs to fall or sway. He needs to drop back, and then everything's going to move according to that. And so now our mechanics can be a little off, and we know how precise those mechanics have to be when we're throwing 90, 95, 100 miles an hour. Or we look at it with a hitter with a big leg kick who can't really get up into that foot now or create that arch. And it's just really going to be acting on those big muscles, those extrinsic muscles to be like, oh, hey, I don't have the sensory mapping or the proper intrinsic foot muscle control. So instead of acting as propulsive, I need to act as a stability form. I need to act as a stability motion now. So I'm not going to give you access to this big power push off. Like I need to feel safe, and that's to stabilize your foot. So I find when a lot of this sensory mapping and intrinsic foot muscle gets weak or we lose how the foot to sense the ground, I see you hear a lot of people, you'll have a really mobile ankle or a really tight ankle even, but they're always, man, my calves are always tight.
Yeah.
My calves are always tight. And what I find when calves are always tight is they're using their tightness to create stability of the foot because they're not having any other sensory mapping or any other activity in intrinsic. So I have nothing to do but tighten up.
Yeah.
And so I think that is where a big part of this in the baseball world or even running world, man, of the tight shoes. And we'll get in, I'll elaborate that on later, but we see in cast, right? When we cast a guy up and we take it off a cast, leg cast, how much smaller is their calf muscle compared to the other side? Well, same thing to a longer degree of tight shoes. I always ask people hey, we like to do this with our fingers. We need to have the dexterity of the hands to write and move and grip stuff. Do this with your hand all day.
Yeah.
And try to move it and use it properly. There's no way that's going to work. And you're just going to stiffen that system up, and it has nothing to do but be tight.
One of the things that it fascinates me as well. I mean, maybe it plays on this density of, just the fact that you're mechanically making the foot smaller by putting it into a shoe. And I know we'll dig into that later, but I don't think what people realize too is you mentioned 29 muscles, 19 of them specific to the foot itself, but those are all tendons. Let's be real. And anything working in the foot does not have this big muscle belly. Like you look at a quad, you look at a biceps, you look at, hamstrings. They have these big, long muscle bellies, which have great blood supply. We also know tendons don't have that, right? Otherwise, rotator cuff tears would heal a lot easier. And do you think that plays into why there's such an element of chronicity to foot issues? Is that it's an area that it is very, claustrophobic. It's very condensed. But on top of that, you're also dealing with tendinous structures, which theoretically probably become more gritty, more fibrotic, but nasty because of the poor blood supply.
Absolutely. And we know with ischemic compression that we're going to cancel out that blood supply. So if we're in really tight socks or really tight shoes, I think another thing that leads to chronicity issues is, if it's a hand, wrist, elbow, shoulder, I can lay off the load. I don't need to put load through it. I can use my other arm, or I can dictate other functions to use to not have that shoulder aggravate. a minor foot injury or a minor foot chronicity, like a lot of people are going to push through that. And unless you're going
Yeah.
to be on crutches or a wheelchair, it's going to constantly get loaded.
Yeah.
And so if it constantly gets loaded in an aberrant manner or kind of a non-efficient manner, it's going to take that much longer to kind of unwind that. And that's why I
Yeah.
think a lot of this stuff takes a long time, because it hurts when my foot gets into this position. Well, when you get fatigued and everything, we know we always fall back onto old motor patterns.
Yeah.
And I think when people are on their feet all day, the nurses, the
Strength
teachers,
coaches.
strength coaches, the teachers, the nurses, they're on their feet for forever, and they're just living on these passive structures that they just get fatigued and they just revert back to these old movement patterns that might not be efficient. Because we know that the body's always going to do what it's either programmed to do from a neuroplastic standpoint or whatever feels safest.
Yeah.
And even sometimes that happens at the detriment of our own joints and even pain.
Mhm.
And so I think that's a big thing that leads to the chronicity of it as well, is the inability to kind of lay off that foot in a day-to-day manner, especially if it's not super serious.
Yeah. We've kind of hinted at this, I think, in conversations. I remember hearing somewhere, and I have no idea if this is true. You'd know better than I, but someone told me that there is more proprioceptive function in the hands and the feet than in the rest of the body combined. Like that you have more capabilities. It's obviously how you interact with the world. So can you maybe speak to kind of the sensory motor components of the foot? Like, I think we think so much in terms of motor function, right? It's efferent, versus like the feedback that we get from the ground, the afferent input that really drives how a system responds to the environment. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Absolutely. Behind the hand, we know that the intrinsic foot muscles have the highest density of muscle spindles, which are basically receptors or kind of sensors that send signals back to the brain, afferent signal back to the brain to be like, hey, my foot's in a safe position, it's in a good position. And we also, like stated before, there's 107 ligaments in that foot with not very big muscles. And so with all those bones needing to flatten out and coil and constantly move when we're walking, there should be constant feedback of into the body. Hey, did I land too hard on this foot? Did I land a little more on the outside? Did I get a little too far forward? And then we move that into, again, back into shoe wear. A super foamy shoe, sometimes they're needed, especially in our older population, if they're really struggling with dorsiflexion from just arthritic joints or hallux rigidus and can't get to that big toe. So we're going to help everything go. But in a healthy population, when you get real big foamy shoes, there's two things that happen. A, when we hit the ground, a lot of that force gets pushed through the foam. And now our foot, we can't sense if we're overstriding or we're understriding. Can't tell if I'm landing on the inside or the outside because it just feels like I'm on clouds. And then it only is acting with one interface. And so those little times when you're outside, walking outside, and now your foot's got to be in all these positions, it's like, whoa, like this is new territory, going from an untrained individual to now training. It's like, hey, we're sore. We're really sore for that first 2 weeks until you get into it. And it's like, nah, I can start to handle these loads. And so I find a lot of the decreased sensory mapping when we really confine ourselves to one surface, or we're not subjecting ourselves to a variety of different stimuli: grass, sand, hard ground, soft ground. And I find that walking barefoot or you're walking on something slippery, even with shoes on, you kind of feel your whole body tighten up. When we kind of get into that and into that foot back into a barefoot or more of a kind of sensory mapping that first little bit, that body doesn't feel safe. So everything goes into compression mode to kind of create a stable structure for everything up to keep healthy. And so while creating strong feet and good sensory mapping, that allows the rest of the body to kind of relax because it feels like, oh, I can accept the ground and be just fine. I can handle these loads.
I think that's fascinating. But, I think we've spoken very specifically to, I guess, structure. Let's talk function. Like what are the nuts and bolts of foot mechanics? What do folks need to know about how a properly functioning foot works? And then maybe, the parallel to that is, what do you see for the most common issues?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing to realize with the foot, that it is a mobile coil, kind of a spring. We go from a supinated or an external rotated into this, like if this is my heel and this is my toe, landing on the outside, slowly rolling to that big foot, flattening to create the most surface area to distribute the forces properly. and then getting up onto that big toe, creating the windlass mechanism. And for those, quick explanation is that's the connective tissue that kind of runs from the toes, mainly the big toe, through the plantar fascia, up and around the calf, and kind of creates this propulsive method to kind of keep you moving.
Mhm.
And if we're not allowing that to go rigid to soft and pliable back to rigid, we're not using a good propulsive phase, and we got to kind of use a lot of other things to kind of get us moving. And the biggest things and issues I see here are definitely like lack of big toe.
Mhm.
Whether that be from old ankle sprains, whether that be from tight shoes. Again, if this is midline, toes going out here, which we know from some research and stuff, that's a late propulsive phase. So it's constantly going to be rigid. And if that's going to happen, we have a hard time going from supination to controlling pronation. What ends up happening is it just stays rigid. So it goes here and just falls as a unit and just slams into the ground. And we either can't get up into our big toe or we roll off to the side, which is just going to lend its issues up the chain. And I find that what can happen is, especially with ankle sprains, this is the big one. And not just ankle sprains that like you really blow up and bruise up and you got to be in a boot, which I find with those are much easier to rehab and get back to normal. It's those little ones. You might have had a bad one. It's those little tweaks, right? I shake it off a couple days, I'm good to go. We know that those constant stretching of those mechanic receptors can kind of dampen their signal, and they kind of lose their space, or they lose their ability to let the brain know where it's at in space. In the brain, there's this thing called the homunculus, which is each centimeter and each individual part of our body is mapped in that brain to give it a sense of where it's at in space. What we know about some pain science and things is the body, the way to protect itself when there's repetitive injury or pain, that someone's like kind of going into that brain and kind of sweeping it and kind of smearing it. So now it's hard for your brain to, is this my lower leg? Is this my foot? Is this my knee?
It's like a swollen joint.
You know exactly. And so those little ankle tweaks and lack of rehab or proper re-education, that's when we start to see the ankle tweaks, and then it can't control itself. And now it's like, I don't know where I'm at in space. So again, if I don't feel safe, I'm going to stiffen up.
Yeah.
And so
the thing I would say is a follow-up to that, and maybe this is this should be a lightning round question, but I'm going to use it in advance. But when you roll an ankle, right? You see a rolled ankle, are you icing, compressing, and elevating?
Never.
Me neither.
I mean, unless it's blown up, swollen, I might elevate it a level. But from my chiropractic background, immediate ankle sprain, I'm joint mobbing that ankle sprain unless we're like full tear, heavy grade too.
We're all in on banded distractions, tons of motion, Mark Pro it like crazy.
Exactly.
And they might look terrible, and they're incredibly highly functional.
Exactly. Bruising makes it sometimes make it look a lot worse than it actually is. Just it can be a heavy blood supply and then gravity and everything going down. So it sometimes looks a lot worse than it is. But I tell kids all the time, motion is potion. Like load it up as soon as you can.
Yeah.
I like to use the instead of the old term rice, ice, compress, elevate. I was told a long time ago, call it kind of police, like protect, optimally load, and then elevate as you need. And if obviously the first 10, if it's so bad and someone needs to numb the pain, I don't mind throwing some ice on it.
I mean, first off, rule out a fracture. That's the name.
Let's rule out the name.
My buddy Neil Rampy was Diamondbacks, Dodgers, now the Cubs. He had a great line. Neil said, "Don't confuse neurology with physiology, because you can get spooked by how ugly they might look." And you see guys that do it, and then they're running 95% of their max velocity 2 hours later just because you distracted it and moved it around. So we're lockstep on that, man. That's a good thing. But digging more on the big toe for me, right? Because we see some really rigid big toes. We see some crazy bunions, all that stuff, and everything's related. So talk to me about where that fits into your treatment strategies, like what the common issues you see surrounding the big toe really are.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people will get scared off, bunions, need bunion surgery ASAP, unless it's really, really rigid and bony rigid. We get an x-ray and there's a lot of arthritic bone on bone. Then we can start talking about some heel rise footwear that are going to help you rock that. We can start looking at some different loading strategies so we're not way up on that toe, just cranking into that joint. But for the most part, if we've got a healthy joint from either an x-ray or I can move it around and get some motion, then we just need to strengthen it and get that back to a good splayed tripod position. Because we know, again, 40% of that intrinsic muscle goes to the big toe. And then why, like I've always wondered, I've always asked this, like, why is the big toe the biggest out of all the other toes? Because it's the one that needs to push off first.
Yeah.
Or last. It's the big propulsive mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
It's got the most connective tissue to the windlass mechanism.
Yeah.
And so what I find is, and sometimes the symptoms might not even be at the toe. Mm-hmm. Like they can rear their ugly head, knee, hip, low back, even into a mid back a little bit, which will throw off your rotation when you run. Because we know that if we're not getting to that big toe extension around 45 degrees walking and up to like 60 when we're sprinting, that we're going to terminate early heel rise, which is going to allow knee extension to be early. And we know if we have proper big toe extension and getting into that push off, it's going to allow that knee to get to full extension and externally rotate that lock mechanism and create a rigid lever up to push off and create force, which allows the foot to get into a good supinated position to start the next phase of gait. If we lose that early, that knee stays bent, that tibia doesn't lock home, and then that foot just can't control pronation at all because it's just constantly in a pronated position already, and we just dump even further.
Yeah.
And then with the knee flex early, we know that we're not going to get to terminal knee extension, so we're going to start hip flexion early for the next cycle, which means we're losing out on a bunch of hip extension and a bunch of glute max, glute med kind of force through the ground to give us propulsive phase. But at the same time, like we know, the athletes are the best compensators in the world. And the goal achieving, I'm going to get going forward and I'm going to get going fast. And we see all the time in a pro hip extension, or we see guys give early bird dogs cranking in that low back. And that's a big thing that I see, just that dumping of the pelvis, because they aren't able to get themselves getting a good propulsive phase through the big toe and an extended knee. So they've got to make that up through the pelvis and the low back to get them going forward.
The bunion conversation to me is like fascinating, and credit to Bill Hartman for completely reshaping how I look at it. Right. You've always understood, right? Lateral aspect of the calcaneus, the heel bone sets down, you're in a supinated position that kicks off the process of pronation, gives us a flatter foot, adjustment to, unstable terrain, all that fun stuff. And then we obviously have to switch back over to a supinated foot. But if that pronation takes place for a long time, you can certainly develop a bunion. So this is the bunion you see in like, these distance runners, that, don't necessarily have an appreciable level of strength through the, hip external rotators, all these things that decelerate pronation, right? Exactly. But then you've treated NFL guys. I've been around NBA basketball players, high level tennis players, tons and tons of baseball players, certainly
general public
pitchers on their their trailing leg. Some of the absolute best athletes on the planet have these massive bunions. Like some of them are so condensed that like the middle toe is popping up like on top of the bunion. And Bill completely reshaped the way I look at it. I always looked at it as like, is this an injury risk? Is it just a matter of time until someone's going to blow out some kind of ligament structure on the medial aspect of the foot? Instead, it's actually these guys are living right at the end of pronation. So they're like right at the tip of being able to propel. It's like, doing a vertical jump where you only descend a little bit. Nobody jumps higher because they go further down, right? Exactly. It's all about being quick and elastic and turning it around. It's just happening at a big toe, and nobody thinks about it like it's a hip extensor or, an internal rotator of the shoulder during the throwing motion, all that. So like, I look at bunions completely different, but I guess the question is, you get a bunion that's big in an athlete, even if it's asymptomatic, what are you doing for it? Are you managing those 40% soft tissue structures? Are you thinking toe spacers? Are you just trying to preserve whatever semblance of variability, knowing that it is to some degree their superpower that makes them really, really good at returning for an offensive rebound or, changing direction, being quick on their feet?
Yeah. And so for me, it's, what is the context of the sport and what are we trying to get out of it? And then secondarily, for me, I'm just a big strength and load guy. It's going to be hard to change the dynamic of that toe, especially, we look at, again, back to the toe box and the skinny toe box, whether cleats or basketball shoes, especially, like if that's their sport, they're not going to get out of that kind of compressed kind of phase. So how do we go about, instead of just cranking on the joints and kind of cranking, or toe spacers are great, but how do I just create as strong a foot in that foot as possible as I can, whether that be through some banded work, whether that be through some banded toe, like banded through the big toe and some toe flexion here, working on just even just mechanical stuff of putting them in toe spacers and learning how to rock up and down on that heel. But for me, it's just a lot of context of sport. I'm not looking at it. It gets worrisome when it becomes symptomatic because of that. If we're here, that stress of that line of drive when we're going goes right through that base of the med head, right?
Mhm.
Or the base of the carpal. And so that's when that bone stress injury can kind of happen. But for a lot of guys who are, again, athletes and superhumans and superpowers, I'm just trying to create as much strength in that foot as possible to be able to handle loads for as long as possible. And it's not going to be until we get them out of those shoes or they're out of their sport that we can really start working on structure.
Mhm.
But we're not going to get them out of that position quickly, especially at 162 games or
Yeah,
playing basketball all the time. So just how do we work with what we have and how do we make it just as strong as we can?
I love that. We're gonna talk about footwear. I'm jumping a few questions ahead, but let's talk about first, and you hinted at it, I think really early on. Let's talk about just the sheer loads that are placed on, the foot/lower extremity during sport participation. Like, what are our athletes encountering? And obviously to follow up to that, what are the key strategies for building tissue tolerance to overcome this?
Totally. For me, it's easy math for me from like a running standpoint.
Mhm.
Like if we look at, the foot complex and calf complex is anywhere I've read from 3 to 8 times body weight.
Yeah.
So let's take a 150-pound runner. Let's take, which is, so then it will be about 600 pounds of pressure with each step. And if we take a 5 mile run, that's going to be equal up to about 1,300 tons of pressure.
And
And if
people are
we're
worried that strength training is going to stunt kids' growth. Like, I think
right,
this is a great way to remind them. Like, kids jump out of trees all the time. They have heavy backpacks. Like,
yeah,
what we do in a weight room in a controlled setting doesn't even come to close to approximating the stress people just get running around.
100%. Walking's 2 to 3 times load. Average person. I don't know about nowadays. Maybe this is a little older now. Western society and sitting a lot, but people walk an average of 115,000 miles in their lifetime. Like that's a lot of load on the foot. So if we're not even doing the bare basics of body weight calf raises multiple times a week,
Mhm.
then we're really sacrificing a lot of foot and calf strength that's going to rear its ugly head up the chain.
Yeah.
There's been some studies that we look from a single leg healthy male. So our population 20 to 30, 30 to 39, 37 reps for males, single leg calf raise at 60 beats per minute on a 10-degree box. You should be able to do 37 single leg calf raises. I knew I was working on my calf raises a lot. I think I got to like 24 before I couldn't even handle it. And this is, it might shock some people, but again, like when olden times, even early 1900s and 1950s, people were on their feet a lot. They pushed off a lot. Their calves were ready for it. So when we're sitting a lot and we're not activating those tissues and they atrophy, that it's going to be
Yeah.
really hard to kind of handle those loads throughout the day.
Mhm.
And so again, the soleus alone versus the gastroc being a very kind of tight to fast twitch, kind of be your sprint,
Yeah.
and your soleus being kind of your type 1 oxidative kind of endurance muscle. That's 6 times body weight just jogging.
Yeah.
And
I
so
love that observation because I think you probably agree with me. So much of, and I think this is a good thing, so much of rehabilitation now is heavily predicated on this regional interdependence scenario, right? Like your knee hurts, let's work on your hip, let's work on your ankle, right?
mhm.
Very rarely, I think, do we see people who go to rehab for patellar tendinopathy and they just do a bunch of leg extensions. But there was an era, frankly, when people went and they rested long enough for things to settle down. Then they started doing a bunch of quad sets, leg extension, all these things. They basically strengthened the weakened degenerative tendon enough to like kind of give themselves just a little bit of a buffer. And
Mhm.
I think I've steered myself away from that, but there are times like we talked about it actually at the facility today with a guy. Like we were doing isometric stuff for a chronic patellar tendinopathy. There absolutely is a place for it. Like, do you think calf raises have been have lost in the shuffle? Obviously, we've done more sprint angle series with the work of Cal Dietz and all that stuff. But do you think in general, like across the board, we need to get back to actually getting people to do more calf raises?
Yeah. Absolutely. Heavy ISO loads from different angles, whether knee bend at 110 degrees, which we see a lot of soleus activity come through. Again, just with not a lot of people being on their feet nowadays,
Yeah.
it just atrophies so quick. And then people are like, oh, I went walking and now my feet are so tired and
Yeah.
painful. Like, no, if I can just get you calf raising 3 to 4 times a week and doing some, wear a heavy backpack and walk on your toes, I think that's like a great starting point to be
I
able to
love that.
start working. Dr. Michael McCod, he wrote all for human locomotion. He wrote a fall prevention program. So he's like, people just need to start doing 4 sets of 25 calf raises, 4 times a week. That
Mhm.
doesn't have to be right in a training session. You could do one in the morning,
Yeah.
2 in the afternoon, and one in the evening. But you usually start to see a really good signal in the calf and the calf strength within about 4 to 6 weeks of training.
That's fascinating. So let's go back to footwear. Footwear is fascinating to me. Full disclosure, I've consulted for New Balance for 14 years now, and I've learned a ton about, just about everything imaginable. Here's what I can tell you is we've seen some remarkable results in some very, very big name players just switching them to New Balance. And one of the reasons, very simply, is they make a wide toe box cleat. Like when you see some of these guys who excuse me, have these structural foot types that do not do well with narrow cleats, getting them into some, even wearing like off the rack stuff has been an absolute difference maker. But probably I think the next step now is more so for our higher level athletes is you can get custom cleats so fast. In the past, you had to
Mm-hmm.
go pour mold, you had to do all these different things. And now with the nature of like 3D printing stuff and all, even going through the shoe designs that we've done for the CSP Minimus, like, you can kind of pick them out and they arrive with a sample, a week and a half, 2 weeks later. It's
Mm-hmm.
incredible. So I'm curious, like, what are the conversations that you find yourself having with patients and athletes about finding the right pair of shoes for both their functional demands, but also, their unique movement profiles?
Right, exactly. Again, it's all going to be context based.
Yeah.
Do we have a structurally, genetically like rigid foot that can't really move well due to a variety of genetic factors? So I need to get you in kind of a better shoe to just kind of help mitigate those issues because we're just not going to be able to flatten out that elderly person who needs kind of a high heel rocker to get them over that hallux rigidus kind of shoe. But most of the time with my young athletes and stuff, and in that, one of your first papers and stuff that you did with like Bosu ball training and unstable surface training, how it doesn't really translate over, right? Like how many of the kids do we see in there with big cushion shoes on there and we're doing some split stance stuff and you see their foot shaking all over the place? It's almost like an unstable surface.
Mhm.
And again, that foot's going to be changing massive positions in the shoes. And then we're asking these kids to load up 2, 3, 4 times body weight. What's that going to do to a lateral knee or a medial knee or a hip that now that foot kind of goes with load and everything's got to kind of tighten up and spaz out. And so, or we see them in really tight shoes, really tight compressive shoes. That again, it's like you ever try to grab something with a big glove on and you can't really feel what it is. Your body's not being able to understand where I'm landing or, big movement plyo days. I'm not getting the full force out of my foot because I'm real restricted in its movement. And then we also know most shoes these days have, if this is a zero drop, an 8 to 13 millimeter drop. Again, I'm just already in that kind of heel elevated raised late propulsive anterior shift. So that's when you start to see those, bottom of 2, 3, 4 med heads stress fractures,
Mhm.
right? Because that big toe gets pressed, middle of the arch collapses, and that's the first thing that's coming in contact with the ground now. And they're just not meant to handle that load. Or I believe Dr. Laura Conley at one point, I think it was like either a 3 inch or 4 inch heel due to the society of a lot of women wearing high heels will put like a 30% increased load on the anterior knee. And because it's just going to push our body forward. And if you look at the research, like women are going at a higher rate of knee and hip replacements
Yeah.
than men. And I think that's a part of the reason, whether that might be a genetic reason for the pelvis being a different shape and Q angles and lateral loads. But I think heel wearing and high heels and wedges have definitely placed an aberrant load on those knees.
Yeah.
And then, we always look at like, oh, you have high arches or you have flat feet. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, is that necessarily bad? I see a bunch of wide, we study a lot of infrasternal angle stuff at the gym. We've talked about, wides are going to be a little bit more rolled in. They're going to have a little bit of that flatter feet presentation, or those narrows are going to be real high and rigid. Like, that's their archetype. That's how they work. But are they able to control and create that motion in that foot? And if they are, why do I need to put them in an orthotic to block that high arch? And now I'm just not letting that foot splay. Or why do I need to create an arch for a guy with a flat foot? Like flat feet are important. High arches are important. It's when you have the inability to kind of control those two
That
extremes.
movement variability.
Exactly, right? We look at bridges that have an arch, right? People roll hundreds and hundreds and thousands of pounds over those bridges all the time. That's our body weight on top. Like an arch is very supportive. It's not until we put something up underneath does that bridge start to weaken. And so I think there's a time and place for that orthotic to be presented. But for most of the time, it's just teach a kid, especially a kid in a young mobile foot, just learn how to activate and control that foot into pronation and supination into a short foot and lengthened foot. And you're going to save yourself a lot of issues.
Yeah. I think also the footwear discussion is key. Like you hinted at like kind of the soft, squishy footwear. And yeah, I did my master's thesis on unstable surface training. We looked at, Dynadisc. And what was fascinating about that study is we really did not change a high percentage. It was one exercise 3 times a week that we did on unstable surface training versus stable surface training. This was, all the way back in 2005, we collected data. But what was fascinating was that even just what I would call probably 5% of total training volume, it was a trivial amount, could actually make some significant change. It attenuated improvements in strength and power gains, basically, with folks. They didn't get as fast as their stable surface counterparts. And what's interesting though is I'm fully on board with unstable surface training. People think I adamantly against doing it. We've got a BOSU ball in the facility, we do stuff on Eric's pads. We do it in people with a history of functional ankle instability, people who have that proprioceptive delay in their peroneals after a lateral ankle sprain that you alluded to. And we do a ton of it in the upper extremity, right? Because the upper extremity works a lot more in open chain activity. You have a wide variety of movements you have to encounter. We generally interact with a very stable ground. And so the overwhelming majority of our training, I think, should really accommodate that. So I think they're important differentiations to make, but when you put on a pair of very squishy shoes, I think actually what you do is you heighten antagonist recruitment. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
You're literally driving with the park and brake on. And if we look at what happens in the chronic adaptation to strain conditioning, yes, the agonists get stronger. You learn how to recruit the prime movers better. But what also people don't realize is you actually learn how to tone down the antagonists. You learn how to take the parking brake off so that you can drive a lot faster. And I worry that we have this group of athletes. We all know the shoe. They're super squishy. They got the 18 millimeter heel toe drop. They have zero lateral support. You couldn't run a 5-10-5 if you tried. And those things have kind of permeated their way into a lot of training settings. And I'd rather have people just run barefoot. It's crazy.
Just go barefoot.
Yeah. So
for a lot of our skip and movement days and plyos, I would love for those all to be done barefoot.
Yep.
Sense the ground, feel the ground, where are we hitting? And you can start to get direct inner feedback. We can see it, but you can feel it.
Yeah.
And you can't hide away from the weaknesses anymore.
Yeah. Are you a fan of rock walks? The mats with the rocks on them? And we both know you watch people walk on them the first time, they hate it. They're miserable.
Hate it.
And then 2 weeks later, they race to it the second they walk into the facility.
Exactly.
That quick an adjustment.
Exactly. It's just getting different sensory mapping. The brain doesn't like to be taken out of what its comfort zone is. And so the moment you start changing that up, it starts to freak out a little bit. This is new. I don't know if I like this.
Yeah.
And the more you do it, the more you get that sensory mapping back in the brain. It's oh, you know what? Actually, I like this. I start to do it more. So yeah, I like rock walking. I've always wanted to create a little wooden walkway path with a bunch of kind of different size rocks in it, whether from big boulder to little smaller pebbles, and just have people walk in that for 15 minutes forward and backward and kind of let their foot just naturally shape around that and create those joint angles in a bunch of different variety of motions to allow those muscles to fire and work in a bunch of different ways.
We're very spoiled at CSP and being in Palm Beach Gardens. I'm not sure you realize this, but we have true Florida grass, which is very kind of spiky, rough terrain. We have a very like natural, like baseball field type grass right next to the facility. Obviously, there's concrete, there's sidewalks around us. Our turf right next to the facility is sand based because in part they use it for a Miracle League field, and the sand base is better for the wheelchairs when kids are out there on Thursday nights. Once we
Hmm.
come into the facility, we have the rubberized flooring, but we also have a different type of turf that it has a little bit more stiffness to it. It doesn't give quite as much as the sand base. So I've thought often about this. We roll all that together and then we send guys to the beach. We kind of have like surfaces for all seasons and just give guys a wide variety of exposure. We just got to get them out of their shoes to actually enjoy it.
I'm working with at the office one of the guys who blew out his Achilles, and he was
Yeah.
missing some serious rehab portions early. And then when I had got there, Andrew and him had approached me and like, we can't get this guy to jump or sprint or move heavy weight without his Achilles going. And we just started from the ground zero again. But we got him to the point of like, hey, what do I need to do? I was like, you fish, go be on the sand barefoot for a couple hours and just walk. And like that, walking barefoot on the sand will tax you.
What's
Like
tiring?
it's very tiring. So even just simple things like that can be great recruitments for foot rehab and stuff. And so like I've told some kids like, hey, after your movement day and stuff, I just want you to walk backwards on the field backwards and kind of change the brain a little bit and really feel. I'm really a big fan of reverse walking from just a brain standpoint and resetting how the feet move. But afterwards, just allowing that foot to start mapping again properly outside your shoes. Granted, it's not too hot. The turf's not too hot in the summer, but really just allowing those feet to kind of walk barefoot after a movement day to kind of relax and just splay and be open and sense the ground again.
I like that. All right, so let's backtrack it. New client comes in, whether they have lower leg pain or not, like what's your foot assessment process and what are your KPIs that you find useful in that world?
Yeah, big one first and foremost, like we did today, was like, hey, are you actively able to separate your toes? Big toe from the fore. Can I can I then passively lift your big toe to ranges of motion, and then can you hold it up through there? That'll tell me a lot right off the bat about your intrinsic kind of foot mapping and strength of that big ability of that big toe.
Mhm.
Secondarily, I'm a big fan of barefoot standing rotation. So if I've got both feet here, if I turn to the right, which is going to be this foot, I should see as I turn to the right, this coil and this
Yeah,
flatten, and it go back and
reciproflexion.
forth.
Yep.
Exactly. And so that will really tell me how your foot is connected to the pelvis and how it works together. Is if you're not getting that reciprocated motion of the foot, your pelvis isn't going to be able to access it either. I'm a big fan of just simple barefoot balance test. How does your foot work in a state? Shoes are fine. I like barefoot though, because I can really see the arches in the foot and the toes either hammer or stay true.
Mhm.
And 15 seconds, 20 seconds, eyes open, eyes closed, because I think eyes closed is important because it's not like we're running or walking, looking down at our feet like, hey, how are these things doing? A lot of it's sight unseen. So how's that interacting with the ground without your eyes on it? And then just flexor brevis, kind of toe flexor strength, whether that want to be the credit card test where you slide it under the big toe and you see how early you can pull it out, or actually getting a little dynamometer with the card that Michael McCod has, and you can actually test like percentage of body weight through there, and that will tell me a lot whether they're actually pressing through their FGD or they're hammer toeing, creating a lot of like extensor recruitment to create that stability. And then a big tell for me will just be laying you on the table passive and seeing if your extensor tendons are just on fire. Like if these all tissues are all about ratios, right? Especially from like lateral ankle sprains being from the peroneals and the tib post, how those two work together to create the stirrup of the foot. Same thing with the flexor digitorum brevis and the toe flexors and the extensors. If those things are really dampened and not working and you're just going into this constant extension statically, like you're automatically just going to be pressed down into that low med head and drop to med head and not create a proper stable surface for yourself. And then I'll just immediately go right into a single leg calf. Just it's not going to take very long. A lot of these people are going to gas out pretty quick. I start looking at a couple things. How high they can get up onto their heel and onto their toe. That tells me the recruitment of the calf and how well their big toe flexion is, dorsiflexion is. I see a lot of people roll out onto the
Yeah.
outside of the heels, whether that be from ankle sprains or
Yeah.
lack of big toe movement or just poor kinematics. And then I'll just look at their endurance. Do we have a 10 to 20% difference in left versus right?
Yeah.
And that might change how I go about some training, because if we're doing some big pogo jumps or big skips and sprints, man, that right leg might not be able to handle as much as that left leg. Now it's going to load the right hip, the right low back, the left shoulder with weight. And so being able to, implement some quick calf raise stuff or some quick isometric stuff to start to bring those a little even, I start to sign some things of these things that might jump around from right knee, left hip, right shoulder, and this kind of X pattern of where things kind of up the chain start to take over for context pending. And so I really try to keep it quick. So it'd be like, again, a static foot stuff, look at the foot from a restful position, and then just look at the integrity of the calf complex.
Good stuff. You can have a conversation of the feet and without having like a discussion of common injuries we see. So like maybe we'll do like a mini lightning round here as well.
Yeah.
What's the first thing that goes through your mind when you hear plantar fasciitis?
Weakened intrinsic muscles and not true plantar fasciitis.
Okay.
That true plantar fasciitis in the morning, first 15 minutes, inflammatory responds well to ice and rest. Man, my plantar fasciitis is acting up at the end of the day after being on my feet all day. A lot of things I've seen plantar fascia stuff really work well with just good foot strengthening.
Yeah.
Because we know from a static standpoint, when we're just standing, our foot is able to just hang out on those passive structures.
Yeah.
But we're walking and creating force and creating movement, and those intrinsic muscles help the stiffness. If those are weakened and dampened, we're just constantly going to be on those passive structures, and they're just not meant for that.
What about Achilles tendinopathy, right in your wheelhouse?
Ooh. Depends. Where is it? Is it paratendon stuff on the sides? Is that even true Achilles, or is that going to be more tib post or extensors, because all those tendons live right up underneath that Achilles tendon area? Is it insertional, where now our calf raise rehab shouldn't be going below parallel, because we're just going to really pull on that insertionals? But most commonly, like 55% is what the research says, is that mid portion Achilles pain. And that is, again, just a load tolerance or foot kinematic sequence of like, am I constantly rolling off the side so I'm shearing that Achilles, or is just my calf inability to handle that load, that off the couch 5K, haven't done any calf raises, but let me just go start running. Like, no, your foot just wasn't ready for that.
I always tell people sometimes you're better off just going directly to the 5K than going through the ridiculous training program to run it.
100%.
More so with marathons,
Yeah.
but I don't know if I'd necessarily advise that. But for a half marathon, I think you or I could probably go fake it through 13 and
it's gonna
miles
suck.
and change. Yeah, just embrace it. But I'd be more likely to hurt trying to do the 12-week build up to it.
Exactly.
What about bunions? We hit it at them a little bit, but where are you going first?
Bunions for me is just going to be, I see bunions. Let me look at long-term footwear.
Does it hurt?
Let me look,
first and foremost?
Yeah, does it hurt? How rigid is it? And let me look at your footwear. And then let me just, if I can move it and passively move it, then I'm just looking that we've got a really lengthened abductor hallucis brevis, and then we just really need to strengthen that.
Yeah.
And the biggest thing I think with all of this stuff in the lower leg is it frustratingly takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time.
Because you're on your feet.
Exactly. Being patient is the biggest key. I think a lot of people and a lot of injuries, but lower legs itself I compare bad days to good days. No, let's just compare bad days. Was this bad day a little better than this bad day? We're getting a little less here, because good days and bad days are going to happen. And if you're constantly chasing a good, then we're going to really be repeating cycles. But if we can start mapping out, especially with chronic stuff like myself, maybe this week wasn't as bad as last week.
Yeah.
It still sucks, but I see some improvement, kind of changing that mental capacity a little bit, or that mental mindset of how we're going to go about attacking these, but they just frustratingly take time. And I think that's the biggest part on the practitioner or the strength coaches to reiterate that, and just the education portion of it being like, hey, this is going to take time. I'm going to give you interventions that keep you safe. Keep working at it.
So let's talk about turf toe as a final one. And I'm really fascinated your answer, because and Shane and I have had some good conversations about this over the years. As the name of turf toe, it becomes like a garbage term. It's like shin splints, right? But we both know, like, from a true definition standpoint, it's a sprain, right? It's a ligamentous tear when it's actually diagnosed clinically. But very few people who say they have turf toe actually have turf toe. So when you're hearing that term, where are you going first? What's your thought process?
For me, again, context pending, if it wasn't a traumatic, like real quick dorsiflexion action or push off from behind and we sprain, it's like, all right, hey, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, like this is a true ligamentous injury. But hey, man, I've got turf toe. all right, let me look at your ability. I can passively lift your big toe, but you can't actively do any of it, but we're forcing it into this
Yeah.
repetitive motions, right? Like kind of maybe like the guy today that we saw
Yeah.
that, you can get it up there, but he can't access it. So it's just going to I feel really rigid in that toe. It's like, nah, you've got the motion, but now we just got to get you actively doing it. So I think it can just be a repetitive stress injury, and that it doesn't necessarily, it needs to be trained with load, just like anything. I'm not going to get off a passive or get into a really cushioned shoe unless symptoms are bad. And we'll mitigate as we need and kind of offload that toe as possible. But I'm loading that safely as much as possible I can to kind of have that ligamentous structure be as protected as possible.
Yeah, I feel like there's just so much tissue density on the medial aspect of the leg that relates to it. And it's interesting is having seen more and more of the chronic turf toes, like the real joint issues. Some of those
Yeah.
guys who have them but haven't had surgical intervention, they've got really ugly joints. Like I mean, they're arthritic. There's bony overgrowth. They're very nasty in there,
Mm-hmm.
and they may be completely asymptomatic. Maybe it's just it's stopped moving effectively because it is so arthritic or whatever it is. Even in younger athletes who have these,
Mm-hmm.
so that's been something I've looked at very, very different over the years. So I've just seen enough of those guys that have discomfort along the big toe that it goes away with good manual therapy and a couple activity modifications when, they
Exactly.
may have been thinking that they were headed down a surgical road.
Or,
Um,
or or I've seen a little bit with, again, that kind of toe being pressed over and the line of drive going right through the
yeah.
underside at a aberrant angle, that just repetitive stress right over that big toe can start to
Yeah.
really upset that ligamentous structure. And if I can get you tracking properly, it really takes that effect away.
Absolutely. If you had to pick a few things to give to every athlete to take care of their feet or interventions, not necessarily give like a product, where would you start if you could do it universally for every athlete?
I would have them do home foot mobility, kind of cranking their foot. Again, that thing wants to be mobile. It's a beautiful complex that needs to get stiff and mobile, but
Mhm.
stiff, a lot of the time, stiff will take care of itself, but we
Yeah.
need to get that thing mobile. Taking those 33 joints through a bunch of ranges of motion. And I'd filmed a little video earlier on that home foot mobility. What's beautiful about the foot exercise, the home foot mobility, and the stuff that I give is, man, there's no sets and reps.
Yep.
Do it 1,000 times a day.
Yep.
And if it cramps up a little bit, good, shake it out and do it some more. Like, that's just the body reorganizing itself. And then, really practicing toe dexterity. I've worked with a couple of the strength coaches and a couple of the guys because they'd seen me doing it and they're like, oh my God, like, how do you do it? I'm like, it took me like 3 or 4 months to really start getting good at it. It was frustrating to me when I would sit there for 10, 15 minutes, lift big toe, all of them would rise and be like, no, just lift your big toe. In the inability to have that differentiation in the body. So, really just starting out practicing toe dexterity, whether from a loaded sitting or just playing with your toes when you're sitting on the couch and watching
Yeah.
them move and trying to just start to figure out how to get some differentiation between those toes. Because again, sensory mapping is everything in the brain. And if I can start to activate those deep flexors and toe dexterity, I'm able to get into a lot more positions. And then it's just simple intrinsic foot strength. Working on FDB, well, whether that you want to do towel scrunches or calf raises 3, 4 times a week again, what we know about the intrinsic foot muscles too in the flexor is that they contract a lot better and you'll get more out of them if they're
Yeah.
on a lengthened standpoint. So putting your foot up under a towel or a little mat wedge and doing some calf raises and really digging your feet. It doesn't even have to be much, or hanging your feet and your balls of your feet off a step. And so only this part of your foot is on the step and you have to maintain this like vertical shin angle
Yeah.
and calf. And that's just going to highlight all of that. So if you can do that multiple times a day, I think those three are the biggest thing. And then the bread and butter is walk barefoot as much as you can outside, symptoms pending.
Just get around. I tell athletes sometimes like, hey, brush your teeth on one foot. Like just find little ways to be barefoot in single leg stance. It's like,
Exactly.
it's small hinges swim big doors. It's a hackneyed
You're
Cresseyism, but it's a good one.
Yeah, you're in sandals. You're at a stoplight. Take your sandal off real quick and practice some toe dexterity.
Yeah.
Or like even just like, and I find like, oh, I don't have time to work on it. Like change topics. Like I'll give breathing exercise to people and be like, I don't have time to work on my breathing exercise. I'm like, you did it 23,000 times a day. Like I think you can find some time to put your hand on your belly and try to expand laterally or post expansively while you're reading this email. Same thing with the foot. You spend some time at home, you spend some time in the morning, shower, whatever, in the car, at your office, in your cubicle. Who cares? Get weird. Take your shoes off and socks off or in the office and start practicing some toe dexterity. And if people have questions about it, just say that I'm getting better.
It's, I mean, it's important stuff, and it's very I think we talk about upstream initiatives, things like sleep, nutrition. These things have trickle down effects to all your results. Like I think it's really hard to find something that has probably the most pronounced effect on athletic performance than taking care of the feet. Like it's how you interact with the ground. It's involved in pretty much every athletic endeavor. It makes perfect sense to kind of make it a priority.
Mm-hmm.
All right, man. Lightning round. You survived the hard foot conversations, which were probably very easy for you. These ones have nothing to do with feet. What's
Gotcha.
the most important book that any aspiring manual therapist should read?
I think two come to mind. One would be Thomas Meyer's Anatomy Trains,
Great
and
book.
that things don't work in isolation, right?
Yep.
Look up the chain, follow the tissue chains. Where the density? Where might this be playing a role? Foot to knee to opposite hip.
Yep.
And then I think secondary, I think a big one for me, man, I think a lot of it might surprise people is this book called Ethics of Touch.
Interesting.
And when people are in pain and they're on your table, they want nothing more than to feel safe.
Yep.
And if you're too much pressure and you're feeling their body really tense up and stuff, read the body, listen to the body, kind of always have a hand on them, kind of reassuring them. And then especially from Ethics of Touch, whether it be from female to male or male to female, and like making sure your hand touch when they're face down and can't see you, that it doesn't come off as something weird, or you kind of always have a hand on their back and tracing them around. I think it's an underrated book to kind of read the Ethics of Touch, because I think anyone who comes into a healthcare office that they don't know what they don't know and they're in pain, they just want to feel safe.
Yeah.
And if you can get them to feel safe, they're going to open up. They're not going to be as guarded. They're going to tell you more, and they're going to allow to be able to relax, which is going to allow you to get into more structures. But if you're dealing with a tense body who doesn't feel safe, then good luck getting through that protection mechanism.
Really good. I've never heard that book, and that's an important lesson for everybody. What's the coolest thing you've done since you arrived in South Florida a few months ago?
Well, coming from baseball and being like a lot of other baseball guys after their career, they need something to do with swinging a stick. So I'm a sicko golfer. I'm not good, but I'm a sicko golfer. And South Florida's got some of the best golf courses around. So being able to golf all the time, or golf on these great courses, and golf year round, which I don't get to do from the Northwest, just being in the rain all the time, it's really awesome. Just be out there and kind of be out there with some friends and some guys, and just getting out there swinging sticks and play all these variety of courses 10, 15, 20 minutes from the house, versus I had to drive hour and a half sometimes in the Northwest to get to these great courses. But we got some of the best in the game around here.
And down here, I think it was at one point Jupiter had 6 of the top 10 golfers in the world as residents. So you're not just playing it; you're actually interacting with PGA guys on every hole. Just
exactly
going out, you see people at Starbucks.
Here's him. All right, here, cool. You golf here too? All right, maybe I should do some of this.
All right, so true or false? And this was your go-to sport. I believe you were top 10 in the nation in your division. Yep. Is the 800 meters the single most brutal event in the track and field world? I've heard 440 hurdles.
Yeah.
You got to be crazy to run that much and jump.
Yeah. So I would put the 400 hurdles and the 800 meter as the toughest single races.
Mm-hmm.
My father being a decathlete and seeing Ashton Eaton and seeing some of these heptathletes, decathlon and heptathletes, what they have to do through a weekend.
Yeah.
Whether 3 events and 2 events or 5 and 5 in a single day or a single weekend is some of the biggest display of endurance, strength, motor control, and power I've ever seen. But man, the 800 is just turning into a sprint these days. I mean, world record's 140. Like Sidney McLaughlin in the 400 hurdles is damn near running flat under 50 seconds. So I'm biased. I ran the 800, but I don't have to jump over anything. But in the 800 with that fast and moving, when you get around that first corner, you've got 8 guys all crashing down to lane 1.
Yeah.
And so on top of having to maintain pace and not getting boxed in, if you get too close, you'll get a spike up the shin.
Mhm.
or you'll spike somebody behind you and throw you off your game. And if you're not even through that, good luck winning that race. So biasly, I would say 800, but 400 hurdles have my nod as well.
What percentage of the 800s you ran did you vomit at the end?
My first year coming from baseball over to track, 100% every single 800 I was throwing up. Every single practice, every hard Tuesday I was throwing up. It wasn't until I got into the hot races, like when I got into
Yeah.
some Stanford races in the
Yeah.
late spring, track would be 100, 105 degrees and you're running
Mhm.
2 laps. I would throw up a lot there. Colder weather, I did a little bit better, but I would say my later years when I was going to nationals and stuff, I'd say probably 50%.
It's incredible.
I'm throwing up, and
That's
there was
what
a
these are the
practice is rough.
self-deprecating moments that make you relatable to athletes and patients. They know that
Yeah,
you at
man.
one point had that level of crazy in you to
Man,
do it
coming
willfully.
coming from baseball to track though, the idea of like running to get sore and then running the next day to get unsore
Yeah.
was like the weirdest. Like what are we doing? I'm used to pitching one day and resting five. Like what? I don't want to run again the next day, but got to do what you got to do.
I love it. This is awesome, man. It's been a blast getting to work with you and exchange a lot of ideas. We've got a couple months together, and it's been really helpful for me. And actually got a nice little social media presence started up on Instagram. It's Dr. Ryan Hansen _ CSPFL. You also got a little Twitter/X presence going on as well. If folks are interested in coming and seeing it at the facility, best bet's probably to reach out to cspflorida@gmail.com or just hit us up at the contact pages on our website at CresseySportsPerformance.com. You're the man. Thanks for taking some time to do this.
Awesome, Eric. I appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day, man. I'll see you later.
For sure.